Well, good morning, everyone. We are so excited to have you all here with us today. This is a really big event. So excited about our guest speaker and how he's going to be talking to us about changes in the code. But first, I want to tell all of our association presidents who have hosted this event. Thank you so much for doing this. I am Jennifer Franklin Rowe. I am the president for Johnston County Association of Realtors, and I also want to thank Terry Wilson with the Albemarle Association, Karen Roberts with Durham Regional Association, Jessica Bryan with Orange Chatham Association, David Pergerson with the Outer Banks Association, and Brett Bushnell with the Raleigh Regional Association of Realtors. Thank you so much for putting this on for us. What I would like to do now is introduce our guest speaker, Matt Difanis. Matt served as the 2020 chair of NAR's Professional Standards Committee. He advanced a series of proposals that ultimately resulted in the addition of the Standards of Practice 10.5 in the NAR Code of Ethics, a prohibition against realtors engaging in discriminatory hate speech. Matt is the 2021 chair of the Professional Standards Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board. He served as 2018 president of the Illinois Realtors Association. During his 4 years on his state leadership team, he gradually became aware of the industry's persistent shortcomings in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and he committed himself to improving it. Matt has since won numerous awards for his work on fair housing and inclusion in the industry. Matt works full-time with his clients in his home market of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, where he leads a high-producing team and is broker-owner of Remax Realty Associates. Matt and his wife, Angel, have 2 teenage children, Gabe and Izzy. Welcome, Matt, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Good morning, everyone. It is really exciting for me to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. So let me tell you why I'm here and what I'm hoping to accomplish. If you have a well-balanced life, if you are a practicing realtor and you are not hanging on every nuance of what NAR is doing at the granular committee level, number one, congratulations on having a well-balanced life. And number two, it means that these changes may have dropped out of the sky on you one day, weeks, or months after they became effective. And depending on where you heard about them, they may have very understandably caused anything from consternation to possibly some anger. So I'm here to give you the backstory. I'm here to tell you how we got here. Here to talk in some detail about the specific problem that we sought to address with the changes. And I'm going to give you as much detail as you want. But what I hope you'll find out over the course of the next 20 or 25 minutes is the changes were targeting a very specific, really bad problem. And the changes are very specific and narrowly targeted. And so I know that the reactions have ranged from, hey, wait a minute, I thought I woke up in a free country. What are you communists trying to do? Is there going to be an NAR thought police? Is this the latest step in cancel culture run amok? Is this political correctness on steroids? Is this some sort of a half-baked, over-rushed, knee-jerk reaction to events of 2020? I've heard all of those things, and I take all of those responses seriously and hope to address all of them. So let's start with the backstory. So the issue of realtors behaving badly is not new. In fact, it's a time-honored tradition. But in the aftermath of the racial unrest in 2020, we saw an issue where really abhorrent instances of realtors engaging in discriminatory hate speech went from the sort of thing that state or local associations would bring up to NAR a couple of times a year to something that turned into 100 of those in the last half of last year. So it was an increase of thousands of percent. The issue is not new. It's always been a tip of the iceberg issue. And I'll give you my own example. I am a multi-office broker owner in the small metro area of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. That's central Illinois. It's 130 miles south of Chicago. In my own company, I reintroduced 2 licensees to the market last year, 2 of them in a very short period of time. One of them had a second offense. It wasn't an overtly racist rant, but I had already done an intervention. It was a second offense, and he was being racially insensitive, and he was getting into flame wars on other people's timelines on Facebook. And so second offense, he was gone. The other one ended up in a flame war in a comment thread on Facebook, got his buttons pushed, and just dropped an out and out racist slur. So that was a one strike. He was gone. He was gone faster than I could find him. There was a firestorm that erupted over it before I even knew that it had happened, and he was gone in a heartbeat. I tell you that because if it's happened twice in my company with 60 licensees, neither of those got reported to the local, state, or National Association of Realtors. So most of these instances before the rules changed just weren't making their way to NAR. Really egregious examples of discriminatory hate speech, you'd have a frustrated state or local exec contacting NAR, say, we have to do something. We have to do something. How do we get this person out? And those associations were using a pretty obscure membership duty obligation to do hearings. But that lane of dealing with these cases was not designed to be stress tested with a lot of volume. And what do I mean by extreme cases? I mean a realtor on a TikTok video shaking an AR-15 into the camera and saying he had just spent $1,500 on this MFer and he couldn't wait to use it on some N-words. That's what I mean when I talk about extreme examples of hate speech by realtors. That stuff had to stop. So I'll tell you the backstory and how we ended up with this series of proposals. We had state and local leaders last year that wrote to NAR saying we need better tools to address this. This is a problem. It is proliferating. It's out of control. We need better tools. Then President of NAR, Vince Malta, kicked it over to the Pro Standards Committee, which I chaired last year. He didn't say fix it. He didn't say do something. He just said look at it, see if this is something that can be addressed in your lane of the organization. And so the Professional Standards Committee at NAR is over 100 people. It includes representatives from every state in the country. And as a result, it's a very large, one of the largest committees in the organization. It's large, but it's also very broad and very representative. I convened a meeting on June 29th of last year to discuss the issue of discriminatory hate speech. And if I'm being totally candid, my concern was that committee, like a lot of other committees, is overwhelmingly white, like 95% white. So I wanted to set the stage for that conversation on discriminatory hate speech with an unvarnished, like no holds barred conversation on race and real estate. So I invited 5 of my Black colleagues and 5 industry leaders from around the country to just have a conversation. No restrictions, nothing off limits. They didn't know what I was going to ask them. I didn't know what I was going to ask them until I got them there. And basically, the invitation was, are you willing to come subject yourself to a no limits conversation with me, bare your soul for the enlightenment of this group of 95%, white folks? And they all agreed to do it. And we had a 90-minute conversation, and I watched in a Zoom window, much like the one that's off in this direction right now. I watched the members of that committee recoil in shock and horror and disgust at what they were realizing is still the reality for Black America and selling real estate while Black in 2020. And if you look like me, this stuff doesn't happen to you, and it doesn't usually happen in front of you. And so for a lot of people, that was new. It was earth-shattering. And to that committee's credit, I can't fault people for not knowing because they haven't seen it and it doesn't happen where they can see it. But man, once we had that conversation, that committee, to be blunt, was pissed off. The sentiment at the end of that meeting on June 29th is, we will pull whatever levers we have within our reach to make that stop. That cannot be allowed to continue. That cannot be who we are. And one of NAR's most clever ad campaigns, the most clever in my career, has been the That's Who We Are campaign. Part of why I like it is because it touts all of our virtues that go outside of our real estate day jobs, which is such an accurate reflection of who most of us are. So I really have loved that campaign, except every time there was a discriminatory hate speech incident perpetrated by a realtor that got picked up by the media for that news cycle, that became who we are. And we can't have that. So there were a couple of issues. First and foremost, this discriminatory hate speech is not victimless. It hurts real people. It is like taking a pickaxe to somebody's soul. This stuff is awful, vile, and toxic. And so first and foremost, this is not victimless. It was hurting real people. Secondly, less importantly, but much more broadly, it paints all of us with a very broad reputational brush. It is very damaging to our reputation every time one of those videos goes viral. And social media isn't the exclusive domain of this stuff, but it is the domain where stuff gets screenshotted or where the video gets shared and goes viral and gets picked up by a news outlet. And even when it's private hate speech, that is to say, even when the realtor is engaging in it outside of the course of their real estate work, the fact that the person's a realtor is always mentioned in the first few words of any article. So that's the backstory. So procedurally, here's what happened with all of this. So we had this meeting. The Pro Standards Committee overwhelmingly was ready to do whatever they could to see if we could craft a solution, but that 100+ member committee is very ill-suited for wordsmithing collectively. So there is a more specialized group, which I chair this year. That's the Professional Standards Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board. That is a specialized subset of that full committee. That's the group that goes way deep in the weeds and that wordsmiths. That group consists of about 15, 18 members. We met 5 times. So there was the meeting, the full committee meeting, June 29th. There were 5 meetings of the more specialized interps group where all of the issues were thoroughly debated. The drafting was done very gradually. We had 3 layers of legal review, no fewer than a couple layers of legal review on everything, as many as 3 or 4 layers on certain parts of it, crafted the proposals. The proposals then went back to the full committee for another 90 minutes of debate. There was a robust conversation, including some very divergent points of view, but at the end of that 90 minutes, the proposals all passed by about a 10-1 margin. Again, big, broad committee representing every single state in the country, 10-1 margin. That then put it on the NAR Board of Directors meeting agenda. So the committee approved it October 5th. The NAR Board of Directors met on November 13th. So that meant that there was a 5-week interval during which this was sort of out for debate, knowing it was coming up for a vote at the NAR Board of Directors meeting. During that period of time, NAR's online hub forum for its volunteers, I fielded I hammered out tens of thousands of words of responses to questions, critiques, and concerns. And then it went to the Board of Directors on November 13th. The meeting was supposed to be 2 hours. The Professional Standards Committee report was 1 hour and 48 minutes. So that was another 1 hour and 48 minutes of vigorous debate, a lot of opinions being able to be heard. And then the 800+ voting members of the NAR Board of Directors that were present that day voted overwhelmingly on all 3 of the clusters of proposals. One of them required a 2/3 supermajority. All of them easily cleared that hurdle. So I tell you that the procedural part, which is kind of boring, but I tell you that so that you understand this wasn't fast. This was not half-baked. This was transparent and it was democratic. So it was all of those things. So I respect you if this dropped out of the sky and you wonder like, what the blank are these people doing? I totally understand, but I tell you that so you know this wasn't all of a sudden. This was going on behind the scenes for months and months. So with that, I'm going to do a screen share and I'm going to dive into the centerpiece of some of this stuff for the next few minutes. One of the things that we heard was, hey, NAR, get back in your lane. This is get back in your lane. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. And I want to point out that, in fact, if you look at NAR's mission statement, our mission is to empower realtors as they preserve, protect, and advance the right to real property for all. Preserve, protect, and advance the right to real property for all. Discriminatory hate speech by realtors had become a meaningful impediment to making that right of real property available for all. And so this is in our lane. This is who we are. This is what we do. So here's the centerpiece of this. It's a new standard of practice under Article 10. Article 10 is the Fair Housing / Anti-Discrimination article. We did not change Article 10 by so much as one word. The new standard of practice slotted in under the existing article language, directly flowing from the pre-existing obligations under the Article 10 language. And so here it is. Realtors must not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. 60% of that verbiage is a list of the 9 Article 10 protected classes. Realtors must not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on an Article 10 protected class. That's very succinct, and yet embedded within it is a 2-step analysis. It is not enough to be an a-hole. Being an a-hole by itself will not get you across the 10-5 hurdle. Now, For a variety of other reasons, I don't recommend that you be a-holes, but being an a-hole won't do it by itself. It can be vile, it can be hateful, it can be awful, it can be offensive, but none of that gets you across the 10-5 hurdle, because it has to be harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs. And secondly, it must be based on or aimed at somebody or a group on the basis of an Article 10 protected class. It has to hit both. Some other items. This was not retroactive. This applied, it became effective immediately. I will tell you that was unusual. Professional standards changes typically take effect the first of the following year, but for two reasons, we had recommended it take effect immediately. One was we wanted to put a symbolic exclamation mark on this, and number two, and quite seriously, can you imagine the last call for discriminatory hate speech if news that this had passed got released, but it wasn't effective until the first of the year, especially given just how abhorrent some of the hate speech examples were. So this is not retroactive. SOP 10-5 became effective on November 13th. The other cleanup items that are related became effective on the first of the year. We have pages of guidance, and I'm not going to go through these in detail, but I'll click through them quickly so you see them. Pages of additional guidance because, all right, well, that seems kind of broad. Who's going to determine what qualifies as hate speech, harassing speech, epithets, or slurs based on? Well, we've got pages of guidance so hearing panels know that. We've got dictionary definitions of things like hate speech and epithet and slur, as well as a reference to NAR's own code of conduct and anti-harassment policy, which already binds our members. One of the most common objections is, hey, wait a minute. Isn't this the latest step in the war against free speech? How dare you tell me what I can and can't say, particularly in my private life? And understand that we take that concern seriously, but understand the First Amendment literally does not apply here. It is not implicated whatsoever. The First Amendment limits the government's ability to impinge upon your freedom of speech, the government or government actors. So initially, this was, of course, in the First Amendment, and it says Congress shall make no law. Subsequent court decisions through the 14th Amendment have applied that to other layers of government. So think of that as the government or government actors cannot restrict your freedom of speech, including your freedom to private hate speech. Now, there have always been limits. The old, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire. There have always been limits, but it is generally applying only to government actors. We are a private trade organization. One of our other ad campaigns was, what makes realtors different? Realtors pledge to live by the code. Realtors voluntarily subscribe to a code of ethics. Realtors hold themselves to a higher standard. So there is no restriction in our ability to say, we're going to have a higher standard, and the First Amendment doesn't apply to us, just like you see countless instances of employers bouncing people because in some cases, very vague provisions of employment contracts. You can't do anything that brings shame or discredit on the organization. So in terms of the freedom of speech argument, we take it seriously. One of the interesting things about realtors, all of these descriptors apply to me, realtors as a group tend to be very small L libertarian. Small L meaning not the political party. We tend to like our autonomy. We tend to be entrepreneurial. We are self-employed and we like it. And by extension, we don't like it when other people tell us what we can and can't do. And I get that. And as I said, all of that is characteristic of me as well. So I don't want to in any way leave you thinking we don't take freedom of speech seriously, but understand technically it doesn't apply. And after an awful lot of debate, we decided there's an opportunity to meaningfully raise the bar on our industry and to apply this narrowly to discriminatory hate speech, really awful, vile stuff. Now, to hit the target that we needed to, because we needed to hit private speech, that's where a lot of this was happening. And remember, your licensing agency can't restrict your private speech. If it was happening outside of the scope of your licensed activities, again, that would be an example of a First Amendment limitation. The government, the licensing agency, a fair housing agency can't go after you for private hate speech. The NAR Code of Ethics can go after private hate speech. So in modern history, the code has only applied to real estate related activities and transactions. Now, the preamble makes clear that you're expected to live by the code in everything that you do, but in modern history, there was a technical restriction that it could only be enforced upon real estate related activities. That has been changed. Now, I want to underscore that has been changed to go after the narrow issue of discriminatory hate speech, even if it was private, because the articles besides 10 are all related to real estate and real estate related activities and transactions. So again, the target was under Article 10, discriminatory hate speech, whether it be private or in the context of real estate. So that change has been made. So the code applies to all a realtor's activities. But again, it's Article 10 that really would go into personal speech, because all of the rest of the articles by their very nature are intrinsically real estate related. We have revised disciplinary guidelines. There is no minimum sanction. You don't go straight to the guillotine. Our disciplinary guidelines make clear that just like other issues of discrimination, it's a big deal. But there is no minimum sanction that is required, and it certainly does not automatically result in suspension or termination of membership. There's a limited subset in the code for years referred to as violations of the public trust. Code of ethics enforcement is confidential. And there's very limited exceptions. So the point of the code is not penalizing and retribution. The point of the code is remediation and education. And to that end, complaints and the outcomes of ethics hearings are confidential. There's a limited exception. If it's a violation of the public trust, a subset of really bad acts, i.e. this stuff is so bad we really are duty bound to report you to the licensing authority, that got revised. That definition of public trust previously said willful discrimination, but that really was incongruous with Article 10. Article 10, the anti-discrimination article, has never required a showing of willfulness. So there was a mismatch there. So that was struck really as more of a cleanup effort. And then also we streamlined the definition of fraud. I will say the mandated reporting requirement will only apply if it happens in real estate. Remember, I just said a minute ago, the government isn't going to be able to do anything about your private discriminatory hate speech. It really would only be able to act on stuff within the scope of your license. So if it is an Article 10 violation under Standard of Practice 10-5 for private hate speech, that will not get reported. Now, you're subject to the entire realm of sanctions under the code, but that doesn't get reported. And that's really it for the screen share. I want to spend most of my time here today answering questions from you and making sure, making sure. So if you'll give me a minute, I'm going to catch up on the chat box. So define harassing in the education world. Yeah. So one of the things, so let me give you a quick disclaimer, because I'm a law school graduate, so I have to be a weasel. I'm not in a position to give advisory opinions. I can't tell you in advance what is or isn't a violation based on a hypothetical that hasn't come before an actual hearing panel. What I can tell you is the equivalent of legislative intent. What was the intent behind this, and what are we working on to provide that guidance? So a couple of things as we get down to Bill's question regarding the definition of harassing. So I'm going to click back in my slides because we do reference that from NAR's anti-harassment policy. But moment. Okay, so NAR's Code of Conduct and Anti-Harassment Policies. Examples of harassment include, but are not limited under NAR's policy. Remember, this all applied to you before any of this stuff changed. Epithets, slurs, or negative stereotyping, threatening, intimidating, or hostile acts, denigrating jokes, the display or circulation of written or graphic material that denigrates or shows hostility toward an individual or a group based on a protected characteristic. Now remember, protected characteristic in this SOP 10.5 context is specifically the Article 10 protected classes. So context matters. So part of why Pro Standards was a suitable place for this is because Pro Standards already has hundreds of pages of due process protections, hundreds of pages. And again, if you are a well-balanced practicing realtor, you have never seen the Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual. You have no idea that there's hundreds of pages of due process protections, which again means that you've not been involved in any of the cases, which is great. But what does that mean? For those who are worried, could this be overbroad? Could I find myself ensnared inadvertently in a 10-5 complaint? I'm going to run you through what that procedure looks like. First of all, somebody has to file a complaint. They have to write a narrative, and the grievance committee is the first stop. The grievance committee does not determine guilt or innocence. The grievance committee has one question. The question is, based on what was written in the narrative, could it be a possible violation? In other words, if I take what was written as true on its face, if I give the complainant the benefit of the doubt and assume it to be true, does that fit within the code of ethics as a possible violation? As an example, somebody that's angry because they saw some realtor at the Capitol riots on January 6th, and they're angry just because they saw a realtor at the Capitol riots, and they hammer out a complaint and claim that it's an Article 10 violation. Well, no, if you don't have evidence that they said something or were wearing something that had discriminatory hate speech on it, no. So there would be an example of, so grievance should bounce that. And the respondent will never even know there was a complaint. So first stop grievance is the allegation, if taken as true on its face, a possible violation. If yes, it goes to a hearing. If it goes to a hearing, at that point, the respondent gets notice that there is a pending complaint. The respondent has the opportunity to challenge for bias any of the potential panelists out of the pool of panel members. The panel members after that get impaneled, and the burden of proof is on the complainant, and they must prove by a strong, clear, and convincing standard that there was a violation. A majority of the panel has to be convinced by that strong, clear, and convincing standard. And if for some reason that process went off the rails, there is a right of appeal, and that appeal is typically heard by an even more elite, specialized, trained group of professional standards volunteers. So part of why this lane was well suited for this is because of these hundreds of pages of procedural guidelines. We can't to refer to a George Carlin act from decades ago, we can't have the 7 words you can't say. It doesn't work that way. Context matters, intent matters. Intent is not dispositive. It doesn't mean somebody can't be found in violation because of something they did or said inadvertently, but intent absolutely can play into this. And so going back to, this is the long Matt Difanis answer to Bill's question. So does it have to be repeated to be harassing? No, not necessarily. But if it were a lower level offense, would repetitive after a person was asked to stop? I'll give an example that's not racial. How about misgendering? Let's say there was a realtor working with a trans client, and the realtor inadvertently misgendered a time or two, was corrected, was asked not to do it again, and repeatedly continued doing it over and over and over. I mean, at some point, the repetitive nature itself would help prove up a claim of harassing speech, but it isn't an absolute essential element. Now, lest you worry that these hearing panels suddenly are empowered with vast amounts of discretion, understand, before any of these changes, hearing panels already within pretty well-established guardrails already had to determine what is or isn't misleading advertising, what is or isn't a true picture. Realtor speech was already, what is or isn't a pertinent fact. Realtor speech was already restricted under the code. Realtors shall not knowingly or recklessly make false or misleading statements about other real estate professionals. So we've already had speech restrictions in the code before any of this. So just know that aspect, the idea that a hearing panel will have to determine, based upon all of the evidence presented, what is or isn't harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on a protected class, that really is not a real new level for those folks. So I'm going to go back to the chat box. Let's say local government puts out an update on COVID infections via social media. In the comments, discussion ensues as to the source of these infections. A realtor states that, quote, infected illegals spreading to as their comment. How, if at all, does that apply via SOP 10-5? So, that could be interpreted. Now, the rest of the scenario would matter, but that could be interpreted as being hate speech targeted at somebody on the basis of their national origin, for example. Now, I wouldn't say that on its face that necessarily looks like it would be a slam dunk. It would require context and some evidence. But that could, what is being described there, could certainly give rise to a complaint, and could, under the right set of circumstances, give rise to a finding of a violation. And I don't see any other chat box questions. So with that, I will be watching for virtual or physical hands. So feel free to jump up and down in your window. But I am here because I really, I'm kind of surprise proof at this point. I want to hear from you and I want to be able to answer your questions. Okay, so Michelle Salyer, what about social media in private groups like mastermind groups where people are lashing out and calling people white privileged? Well, so that brings up one other point, which is the protected classes all exist because specific subsets have been on the receiving end of discrimination historically. So clearly there's a reason why the protected classes exist. However, they are all two-way streets. I would have a cause of action under standard of practice 10-5 if a realtor engaged in hate speech directed at me on the basis of my being white or on the basis of my being male, on the basis of my being Christian, on the basis of my being straight, any of those things. So I do want to underscore that protected classes are all two-way streets. Now, the scenario that gave rise to this was because we were seeing a massive proliferation of abhorrent, discriminatory hate speech, predominantly directed at the Black population. Although our meeting materials on June 29th of last year included a literal stack of hate speech. Most of it was racist hate speech, but there was another one that sticks out in my mind where a realtor posted on social media, quote, "Gays and lesbians are guilty of murder according to the scriptures." That's, we can't have that. That you can't say, for those of you old enough to know who Mr. Rogers is, you can't say, "Oh no, I came home like Mr. Rogers at the beginning of his show. I shed my Realtor sports coat and I put on my private bigot cardigan. And when I took to my keyboard on social media, that was Matt Difanis, private bigot Matt Difanis, hammering away all the hate speech on social media." But don't worry, because private bigot Matt Difanis's conduct on social media in no way interferes with my ability to live up to either the letter or the spirit of my Article 10 obligations. Because think about it. If you engage in discriminatory hate speech as a realtor, part of our debate was you can't shed the realtor branding like a garment. Once a realtor, always a realtor. And any of us who think we're clocked out are not clocked out when somebody calls with an offer. It's just not the way our lives work. It's not the way we're wired. I go back to our kind of libertarian, autonomous, loving bent. That's all good things. But when you think about it, if we allow realtors to engage in discriminatory hate speech and say, "Listen, that's on their private time, that's not my business," the problem is whatever group, whatever person in a protected class that hate speech is directed at, you won't ever know what potential client never did cross the threshold of your office the next day or the next week because you were poisoning the well even on your private time. So the reality is we go back to that NAR mission of promoting and protecting the right and the access of real property for all, and in a very real way, allowing discriminatory hate speech to continue by realtors was shrinking the market of available real estate and available real estate professionals. It had to stop. We had to do something. Nobody who says, "Hey, wait a minute, I have concerns," this feels, because that's usually kind of what it is. It feels like an overreach, or until I understand more how hearing panels are going to make these judgment calls, so I know they're not coming after me with some overbroad dragnet. I get all of that, but nobody who has dissented has seen the stack of hate speech and said, "I stand in defense of that." It's just awful. Nobody has, nobody would. Okay, so can I explain the requirement to report to the regulatory body? Think of it as a mandated reporting requirement for really bad acts. If you're stealing earnest money from little old ladies, and that comes up in an ethics complaint, or if it involves discrimination within the context of licensed activities, then the normal default setting of ethics violations and findings remain confidential. That gets pierced under those special set of public trust violations. I was thinking public fraud. Fraud's one of the subset items. So violations of the public trust will trigger mandated reporting, i.e., after that finding, And after the decision has been ratified by the board of directors, the licensing authority or a fair housing authority, if it was an act of discrimination, gets notified, hey, there was a finding of a violation, and here are our findings of fact. This may bear on the person's license and subject them to possible discipline. So that's how that works. That's not new. That has existed for years. What's the extent of discipline that can be administered? So on the extreme end, suspension or termination. But remember, the trade organization, we are talking code of ethics. We have no bearing on your license. So the same thing that means we're not bound by the First Amendment also means we can't take your license because NAR doesn't issue licenses, nor does your state or local association. It's a trade group. So on the extreme end, you can be suspended or terminated. And depending on the jurisdiction in the country, my area, I am part of a non-realtor association owned MLS, and yet my MLS does require realtor membership. So of course, if I got suspended, I'd lose access to the MLS, but it is not a license law or license suspension or discipline at all. Okay, so what if Senator Ron Johnson was a realtor? Would his comments have been a violation? In other words, how deep does an implied racial connection have to be? So let me talk about that for a minute. So one of the concerns on the general topic of an overreach, hey, wait a minute, is am I going to have somebody filing a 10-5 complaint against me because they don't like the bumper sticker that is on my vehicle, and they claim the bumper sticker is in support of a political candidate that they believe to be racist, and therefore you connect the dots and bang, I got a 10-5 discriminatory hate speech violation? No, that is generally not going to make for a 10-5 violation. And remember, the code only applies to realtors. So it doesn't mean, and I think there's been a real reckoning with this for people that have been following Realtor Party stuff over the last year. There's been a real reckoning because there's been a lack of inclusion around a lot of those tables involving RPAC trustees. And so you have, in some cases, political candidates and office holders who say things that realtors shouldn't say and now could potentially be sanctioned for. So there's not a super bright line here, but it is harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on. So bumper sticker isn't going to do it. We have specifically not been targeting and are specifically not targeting somebody's religious beliefs. In other words, we are sensitive to the fact that we can't have somebody who says, I'm a realtor and I am a socially conservative evangelical, and does this mean that the Sunday school lesson that I was scheduled to teach on Sunday means that I could be in violation of 10-5 because my church doesn't recognize same-sex marriage, for example, when sexual orientation and gender identity are protected classes under the code? And generally, no, it's definitely not aimed at that. Now, I gave you the religiously based example of hate speech. Gays and lesbians are guilty of murder, according to the scriptures, posted publicly on social media by a realtor. That's not exactly love the sinner, hate the sin. That certainly waddles and quacks a lot like hate speech. So we do want to make clear that we're not going after people's politics, people's religious beliefs. And one of the things, while everything that I've described is now already in policy, the work is not done because one of the things that we do to offer guidance to hearing panels is case studies. And the case studies have scenarios and then have the outcomes, and they are intended to provide guidance to hearing panels. And so the first segment of those that we tackled had to do with sexual orientation as a protected class with respect to religious teachings, realtor who happens to be a pastor or Sunday school teacher, that sort of thing. We're doing that to make sure that we're not simply saying it's not our intention to go after that. We want to make sure that members know that the line is drawn. Now, you can't claim a religious exemption across the board. Oh, it doesn't matter how hateful it was. That happens to be my religious belief. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. But we are going to be publishing in the next couple of months a series of case studies that will help hearing panels see where that line is drawn, but mostly for the purposes of making clear that this does not go after somebody's religious belief. I'm reading now on misgendering. Yeah. So, I mean, gender identity is a protected class, but that's just always you need to defer to your client. That's really all. I don't want anyone to think that and I'll tell you, I've had a very interesting journey the last few years. Um, I had a team member that changed genders a few years ago. And I got to say, having a front row seat to that certainly does sensitize one to what people are going through if they come to the very, very, very gut wrenching conclusion that they have been essentially trapped in the wrong gendered body for, their entire lives. So I've had the opportunity to see this up close. It is a very deeply personal situation. This is not a situation where somebody is going to light someone up because I knew the person as one gender and then had to get used to the person as a different gender. That individual is not going to light me up because, just like the person's own family, they mistakenly refer using the wrong gender pronoun. It's a difference between doing it intentionally for the purpose of harassing or disregarding the person's repeated request. No, please do it this way. But I don't want anyone to think that that in and of itself is going to be enough to get across that bar. Is the process for filing complaints the same across all associations? Say I see someone in Illinois post something, but I live in Florida. So that's a great question. So it's interesting because the code of ethics applies to all realtors nationwide. So it's kind of the equivalent of a federal law in that respect, but its enforcement is at the state or local level as opposed to a uniform federal, government, prosecutor and court system. So you can file, anyone has standing to file. That's another difference between us and the courts. Anyone has standing to file a complaint. It can only be filed against a realtor, but anyone has standing to file. If you became aware of something that happened in some other part of the country, you absolutely could file. The case has to be heard in the area that has jurisdiction over that agent. So it would be heard by that agent's state or local. But anyone can file, and an NAR core standard requirement is that every local association in the country have pro standards information and filing information on their website. So there is universal access, and honestly, it doesn't matter where you start. You could go to your own local and start there. The process will work itself out, but it would ultimately be heard in the jurisdiction where the respondent has their primary membership, if that makes sense. I'm also going to make a pitch for allyship here. We're talking about discriminatory hate speech. Discrimination already is often one of those rare offenses where the victim has to deal with it and do something about it. And in the court system, we go to this issue of standing, where if it didn't happen to you, you may not have standing to do it. That doesn't restrict us here. So the Code of Ethics also provides a meaningful opportunity to be an ally. If you become aware that something has happened that is discriminatory and it was against your client, or it was against another realtor colleague, or it became chatter and it got shared around, but the person the person against whom it was directed, or who's in a protected class against whom it was directed, don't make that person carry that torch. Don't say, well, you can file a complaint. That's a violation of standard practice 10-5. Good luck, Godspeed. Don't do that. Remember, hearing panels aren't bound by the traditional rules of evidence. Hearing panels can take oral testimony. They're not bound by hearsay restrictions, so you can testify as to a conversation that you overheard. So you don't have to be the one it happened to file the complaint. And of course, so many of these are happening on social media where somebody has a damning screen share or a viral video that gets shared. But I just want to point out, this is going to provide some meaningful opportunities for other people against whom the hate speech wasn't directed to stand up and be an ally and collect the information, and you carry that torch on behalf of the group that was victimized by it. Don't make the victim bear that burden if there's any way around it. So we have a retroactivity question, but it is a good one. If someone made a racist comment or post 5 or so years ago and someone finds it, so there's not a super bright line there. If it predated November 13th, if the hate speech, the action taken by the would-be respondent predated November 13th of 2020, there is no retroactivity. Now, if on the other hand, the person reshared it or resurrected the comment thread in support or furtherance of the hate speech, certainly that would be possible. I would say it would be a good opportunity for anyone who is concerned to to do a little timeline searching and maybe do a little trimming of any of the stuff that could possibly be a violation, but it is not retroactive. So barring somebody taking action in furtherance of an old post, it should not be within the scope of this. With sexual orientation being protected, how do we navigate gay couples asking which neighborhoods they would be welcome in? This is a very good question. I had a couple ask me about this, and it was frustrating because I felt like I could not help them without violating. So we choose to talk about cities and neighborhoods and general political affiliations. How do we manage this? That is a very good question. Let's see. I'm hearing some audio. There we go.
I can please remind everyone to mute yourself.
I found her. I got that one. Okay, so you're restricted. You can't under the code of ethics. You really can't be giving demographic information in the world of residential real estate. And so that really becomes a little bit of a challenge. So I can't give you specific guidance. The reason is, though, it's our industry's fingerprints that are all over this really awful history of housing discrimination. And part of why we are subject to restrictions that, again, going back to that libertarian bent, it's like, hey, wait a minute, this seems like it's going too far. But remember, housing is a basic human need. So not only are we trading in a basic human need, we're the gatekeepers for that, but on top of that, we also have this awful, awful history of housing discrimination that our fingerprints are all over. Remember, it was realtors and appraisers that drew the red lines on the redlining maps that shut out Black people from generations of homeownership. I'm young enough that fair housing has been the law of the land during the entirety of my lifetime. So it's not that I grew up with my Black classmates who were legally discriminated against, but it sure is the reason why their parents didn't have the net worth my parents had, because their parents were shut out of homeownership and didn't have the opportunity to have access to the single most powerful tool of intergenerational wealth building available to most Americans, which is homeownership. Question from above. What is the role of the association staff or board of directors when we see or are made aware of a violation when the association member doesn't want to file a complaint? So guys, it's a good question, but it's also a common concern. I am a member of a 500 member local association. It is a small sandbox. That means I'm going to have to see people again. I can't lob a grenade and know, well, at least I never have to see them again, because it doesn't work that way. And that's true in most of your markets. And it's true even in Chicago, where people are still in small sub-market sandboxes. That's a common concern. Understand, the association cannot do that. The association has a role in administering the process. And so you can't have the association become the complainant. So by all means, feel free to reach out to an association executive to talk through a concern, but also don't underestimate. I don't want to make it sound like my suggestion is go straight for the guillotine. Never underestimate the power of diplomacy. Find either a managing broker or an intermediary. In some cases, you can have a conversation. By the time you get to a hearing, you're going to have any goodwill torched. People are going to hate each other. And people are going to hate each other for a long time after it's done, no matter how the outcome goes. So don't underestimate the ability to have a managing broker be your diplomat and bring that to the attention of some other managing broker. A lot of cases, these things happen inadvertently. Somebody isn't intentionally being racist, and they just need a sensitivity intervention. And it doesn't necessarily have to come with penalties. But there are countless success stories where broker to broker, you end up with, this agent had no idea. They have now had an epiphany. They are extremely sorry, and that will not ever happen again. And I'll file the complaint myself if it turns out that it happens again, or I'll drop them from my roster. So there's not a perfect answer there. At some point, for ages, the biggest impediment to enforcement of the code, I mean, realtors would complain, oh yeah, we know these violations happen all the time. Well, why aren't you filing a violation? Because I don't want to be the one to file the violation. I'm going to have to see the person again. I don't want to hold the lightning rod. When it comes to issues of discrimination, if you look like me, please grab the lightning rod. Please. If it is... So am I saying that we should never have the grievance committee file a complaint? If it is a potential violation of the public trust, the grievance committee can act as the complainant. But that is a pretty rare exception. And remember, if you dump that on the grievance committee and they weren't actually in a position to have access to all the evidence, and there's now nobody to bring in to testify. So it doesn't mean that grievance, but that's different than the staff. So grievance can, if a complainant drops out, but it is a potential violation of the public trust, grievance does have the ability to step in as the complainant. Just understand that's going to oftentimes significantly weaken the case. And I don't know, I'll have to look. I'm pretty surprise proof, but that's such an in the weeds question. I'd have to look. I don't think grievance can just spontaneously do it on their own if somebody anonymously sends an envelope of evidence. I know grievance can step in the case that a complainant does not continue to advance that case. And does anyone want to unmute and ask any questions, folks? Otherwise, I see, well, Andrew, I see your hand is up.
Hey, Matt. Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to ask a question about what you were just talking about associations. I know, I'm sorry, handling some of these things. I think it's an important opportunity for, I think probably all three levels of the association to look at this, because I think we're always trying to figure out what we as associations can do to improve the businesses, improve the lives of our members. And our members are asking us to help them enforce a ethical and clean environment to do work. And I feel that over the years, we have created this burden on people unintentionally, where in order to file a complaint, hold somebody accountable, they have to risk the very real likelihood of revenge. And that they will be outcast. There will be some kind of punishment for them after they've held this individual accountable. And it brings into question about whether the association, its leadership, can step in and help our members navigate this process, because I think we will find that a lot of these things go unreported. Because how many times have we all heard somebody say, well, I may have to do a deal with them, so, it's not that big of a deal. Well, it is a big deal. We have sworn, the realtors have sworn this oath to uphold the code of ethics unless it doesn't result in the consequences to their business, right? And that's not a part of, a kind of a declaration of the code of ethics. So, I think it's worth having a conversation as organizations at all three levels about what can we do to lower the barrier that people feel to holding people accountable. Because think about it, if I am a person of color who has felt like there has been a violation of 10-5 against me, and I'm going to file a complaint against an all-white grievance committee, how am I going to feel about that? And is it going to create a scenario where I'm like, well, they're not going to side with me anyway, I'm going to be the person complaining? So again, I think it's worth that conversation at all three levels. Understand not wanting to kind of limit the amount of evidence that somebody may put in, but we've got a real problem with people not feeling like they have access equitably to come to the table of the grievance committee. And I think that's important.
There's going to be another related directly to Andrew's issue is, I told you I'm from a small 500 member association. In my state, other than our two mega associations, every other local sends its pro standards to the state for hearing. I think you're going to see a need to look at doing that a little more commonly. The pandemic has forced us into Zoom hearings, which have worked out really, really well. The last hearing I chaired before the pandemic, I had to drive 3 hours to an area just outside of St. Louis each way to chair a 45-minute hearing. My entire day was devoted to a 45-minute hearing. Now it is nothing to bring in hearing panelists and chairs from anywhere in the state. So that all-white jury hearing a case involving a black respondent, that certainly doesn't look or feel like a jury of my peers if I walk in and I am that black respondent. We need to be super aware of that. We need to be sensitive to it. There's several issues. We need to recruit more volunteers into pro standards that don't look like me, but the ones that we we need to be ready to use them across a larger geographic radius than we maybe have before. So I think for locals, if you're not in a very diverse local association, that may mean asking for the state to conduct that hearing so that you have a larger pool. And so those panelists are coming from outside that small local sandbox. But that's a very good point, and it's a continued issue that is on NAR's radar screen. I'm going to share my contact information in the chat box. So if anyone who does not feel comfortable asking a question in front of a bunch of people wants to reach out, now I can't obviously take 1.4 million phone calls from all of our members, but don't hesitate to call if you need something or want clarification or have a concern. So my information is there. I'm going to share 2 other quick links before you go to your breakout rooms. There's an edited video of that conversation on race, real estate, and association leadership that's about 7 minutes that has some of the highlights of that conversation. So I'm going to share a link to that video in the chat box, and then I'll share a link to an uncensored sampling of the hate speech that was also our issue in the chat box. And then I'll hang around for a little bit and bounce into your conversations in the breakout rooms. But I so appreciate you spending time with me.
Matt, thank you so much for your time with us this morning. This has been great information. I think it's cleared up a lot of questions that people have and has really brought to light why this was enacted in the first place. So we appreciate everything that you have done and meeting with us today.